Hi there, I'm Timothy Hillsdale. I'm a video producer and Christian and concerned about my fellow man. Today I'd like to talk about the latest and most alarming news about marijuana. Recently I was reading in the Imprimis magazine from Hillsdale College. It's a great magazine on important subjects of the day in these United States. And this one is on marijuana. Now, you, of course, haven't missed a bit, I'm sure, about states that have been legalizing it for recreational use besides the medical use that's been touted over some time now. But reporter Alex Berenson, reporter and author, he's a Yale graduate, has degrees in history and economics. He's a successful novelist. One of his nonfiction books, though, is Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. And this was a journey for him. His wife, Dr. Jacqueline Berenson, was a senior psychiatrist at New York's Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Institute for the criminally ill. And she had commented to her husband that the inmates all smoked pot. So he immediately said, "So marijuana causes schizophrenia?" That was his response. Now, he hadn't heard that much about that, and I suspect many of us haven't heard anything about that. So as a reporter, he starts digging into this information and found studies clearly expose the danger of marijuana, and the stakes of its use are mental illness and violence. Almost everything we know about health effects of cannabis are almost everything advocates and the media have told you for a generation is wrong. And I quote him, that's his quote. The studies for pain relief are few and associated greater pain over time, he has found in his studies. Now, pot advocates have viewed medical pot laws primarily to protect recreational users. Now, the theory that marijuana would reduce opiate addiction falls flat due to the fact the U.S. has the worst opiate problem and pot use. In January 2018, a paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry showed that people who used cannabis in 2001 were almost 3 times as likely to use opiates 3 years later, even after adjusting for potential risks. Now, Berenson goes on to say a mountain of peer-reviewed research in top medical journals shows that marijuana can cause or worsen severe mental illness, especially psychosis, the medical term for a break from reality. Teenagers who smoke marijuana regularly are about 3 times as likely to develop schizophrenia, the most devastating psychotic disorder. Now, Berenson goes on, after an exhaustive review, the National Academy of Medicine found in 2017 that cannabis use is likely to increase the risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychoses. The higher the use, the greater the risk. Also, that regular cannabis use is likely to increase the risk for developing social anxiety disorder. Now, the number of Americans who use cannabis heavily is soaring. Since 2006, about 3 million Americans reported using cannabis at least 300 times a year, and that's a standard for daily use. But by 2017, that number had nearly tripled to 8 million, which is approaching the daily use of alcohol drinkers, since that's been used as a defense for marijuana use. Now, something important here that Berenson's discovered, that the amount of THC, the chemical tetrahydrocannabinol, probably didn't do that well, did I? THC is the chemical that causes, it's the drug in cannabis. But it's responsible for its psychoactive effects. Now here's an important part. Because years ago, I guess you'd call it your parents' marijuana, if they smoked it, was about 2% of it was this THC. But now it's up to 20 and 25%. And in the states like California, Of course, the users are, they want that stronger hit. They want a stronger amount. And of course, that would lead to a greater and quicker psychosis issue, I should say. I'm not a doctor, so I might be getting these words off a little bit. Now, these new patterns of use have caused problems with the drug disorder. In states like Colorado, emergency room physicians have become experts in cannabis-induced psychosis. Now, cannabis advocates often argue that the drug can't be neurotoxic, as studies suggest, saying there's not a good evidence to show a widespread problem in the population as a whole. But there's no registry that actually exists for schizophrenia or other severe mental disorders. But on the other hand, research in Finland and Denmark, they do track these things more comprehensively, and they show a significant increase in psychosis since 2000 following an increased cannabis use. In September of last year, a large federal survey in the U.S. Has shown serious mental illness in the United States as well, especially among young adults, the heaviest uses of cannabis. According to this later study, about 7.5% of adults age 18 to 25 met the criteria for serious mental illness in 2017. Now, that is double the rate in 2008. Now, what's especially striking is that adolescents from 12 to 17 don't show these increases in cannabis use in severe mental illness. Now, none of these studies prove that rising cannabis use has caused population-wide increases in psychosis or other mental illness. The most that can be said is that they are offering intriguing evidence of a link. And that's the point that Berenson is trying to make, is there's a link that's showing up here. Psychosis is a shockingly high risk factor for violence. Studies have shown people with schizophrenia are 5 times as likely to commit violence, crimes, as healthy people, and almost 20 times as likely to commit homicide. Now, the National Alliance on Mental Illness statement that most people with mental illness are not violent is, of course, accurate, given that most simply means more than half. But it's deeply misleading because schizophrenia is rare, but people with that disorder commit an appreciable fraction of all murders, in the range of 6 to 9%. Now, studies in Schizophrenia Bulletin found that 27% of people with schizophrenia had been diagnosed with cannabis use disorder in their lives. So the evidence is gathering here. Unfortunately, despite its reputation for making users more relaxed and calm, cannabis appears to provoke many to violence. A Swiss study of psychiatric patients published in the Frontiers of Forensic Psychiatry found that over a 3-year period, young men with psychoses who used cannabis had a 50% chance of becoming violent. There was also an Italian study that showed that out of 1,600 psychiatric patients in southern Italy found that cannabis was used and associated with a 10-fold increase in violence. Now, the most obvious way that cannabis fuels violence in psychotic people is through a tendency to cause paranoia. Now, Medical Journal of Australia, in a study of 88 defendants that had committed homicide during psychotic episodes, found that these people believed they were in danger from the victim, and almost 2/3 were misusing cannabis. But studies showing that marijuana use is a significant risk factor for violence have quietly piled up. Researchers have studied alcohol and violence for generations, proving that's a risk factor, of course. Far less work has been done on marijuana, partly because of advocates have stigmatized anyone who raises the issue. So, social psychiatry and psychiatric epidemiology examined drivers of violence among 6,000 British Chinese men and found that the drug use, mainly cannabis, was nearly always translated into a 5-fold increase in violence. I should say that use is increased five-fold increase in violence. Now, the first 4 states to legalize marijuana for recreational use were Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Oregon. Combined, these 4 states had 450 murders and 30,300 aggressive, aggravated assaults in 2013. Last year, that had almost 620 murders, 38,000 aggravated assaults. That's an increase of 37% since they've legalized marijuana recreational use, and a 25% in aggravated assaults. And that's far more than the national increase. Now, example, last September, police in Longmont, Colorado arrested Daniel Lopez for stabbing his brother to death while a neighbor watched. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and was self-medicating with marijuana. Now, cases like Lopez are far more common than either cannabis or mental illness advocates acknowledge. These crimes rarely receive more local attention, more than that. Rarely. But hard data on the relationship between marijuana and madness dates back 150 years. British had some hard data on asylums and registered in India. Yet 20 years ago, the United States moved to encourage wider use of cannabis and opiates, even with the evidence that's beginning to pile up. So, Berenson says we need to equally unambiguous and well-funded advertising campaigns on the risk of cannabis. Instead, we are now in the worst of all worlds. Marijuana is legal in some states, illegal in others, dangerously potent, and sold without warnings everywhere. But before we can do anything, we especially cannabis advocates and those in the elite media who have for too long accepted their claims need to come to terms with the truth about the science of marijuana. That adjustment may be painful, but the alternative is far worse, as the patients in the Mid-Hudson Forensic Psychiatric Institute and their victims know. So, there's something new and alarming in the latest story about marijuana as it moves through the states, through our United States. So I'd recommend look up Imprimis on Hillsdale College on that article on marijuana and read it. I think it's important. Over time, it's going to become even more important. So please do. I'm Timothy Linsdale. Like and comment on my videos. Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.